What if Plato never actually existed? What if Plato is nothing more than a fictitious character created by somebody during the Renaissance? Is this a possibility? Is it possible that this philosopher that we all know as Plato, who is supposed to have existed during the classical times in Greek history, is it possible that this guy never existed? Even more interesting, is it possible that that entire ancient classical era also never existed? Are these real possibilities? The answer is simple. Yes, these are absolutely real possibilities. And the reason why is simple. When we start to look at the evidence that the mainstream currently uses to support its conclusion that the current chronology is correct, that there was indeed some magical, mystical, philosophical, classical era in ancient Greece that created all of this amazing material, when we get down to it, when we take all of these claims made by mainstream, when we take the claim of when this classical era existed, or when Plato or Aristotle existed, or Socrates, or whatever, right? All of these amazing philosophers that are supposed to have existed during classical Greece. Once we expose these conclusions to the scientific method and we start to look at the evidence, it is astounding. I mean, it is sickening how quickly the entire facade falls apart. And there's no way around this. Once you start to look at the mainstream's conclusions under a scientific microscope, or hell, even a telescope at this point, once you start to actually analyze all of the evidence that historians and archaeologists, etc., what all of these mainstream people use to prop up this concept of the Greek classical age, and then of course by extension Plato, once you start to look at this stuff, there's no other choice but to admit that mainstream has lost its mind. At best. The reality is, at worst, we have to look at the evidence for what it is and come to the conclusion that mainstream historians are simply lying to the public. Now, I realize that that sounds brutal, and that's one hell of an accusation. So what basically you're asking, so what am I saying? What is Anachronistic Affliction saying? Is he saying that Mr. Johnson in my high school is in on some crazy conspiracy to tell me that Plato existed when he didn't? No, not at all. Remember, the vast majority of people who teach history nowadays, or who are into history, it doesn't matter if they teach it or not, the vast majority of people are just following what they have been taught. And what these people have been taught is to never question the established chronology, never question the current zeitgeist that mainstream historians use. That's what everybody's taught, right? You are not allowed to look at the evidence that exists and question it, and you are certainly not allowed to look at newer evidence that has the potential to change the entire paradigm of mainstream history. You're just not allowed to do it, are you? It's funny because when you're growing up in a Western, scholastic environment, one of the things you are always taught is to essentially be that person that makes that amazing discovery. That is essentially what kind of everybody is taught is supposed to happen. All of the Western movies are literally based around this kind of a premise, right? There's always the one person who brings ultimate change, and then the world changes and everybody's happy and the evil people die, right? That is literally how everyone is trained. So, and that's not bad necessarily. It's not bad, but the problem is that it does not reflect the reality of the scholastic environment. So by that I mean, when you start your career in history, you eventually maybe go to college for it or whatever, or you start really getting into it, you have been told your entire life that one person is going to find that one item that is going to change everything. So people initially start looking for that one item, right? Because who does not want to be the discoverer of something amazing, right? Who does not want to be remembered as the person who discovered the truth about something, somewhere, whatever, right? That would change everything, and everybody would look up to that person. Everybody's generally taught to go in that direction. So, innocently, most people get into history and they start doing that. And when they start studying real history and they start trying to make that discovery, what they find is not only are there a lot of discoveries out there to make, but they also start to see that mainstream history has no intentions on changing its chronology. Whatever's written in the current textbooks, it's done, even if you end up finding evidence to the contrary. And the thing is funny is that the vast majority of people who get into history will almost immediately discover evidence that is contrary to the mainstream chronology. But what happens, right? The second you see this stuff, you start questioning it. You're like, wait a second. How does X hold up? Or how does Y hold up? Why are these people teaching something that is based on very little or if no evidence at all? This is the kind of problem that young or amateur historians will initially hit. Because when you start to look at the evidence in a way that is supposed to try to make it to where you discover something, because that's the ultimate goal. You want to be the one that discovers something unique, something new, so you can write a paper and be famous, right? Obviously that's not everybody's goal, but that's kind of the thing, right? Everybody looks up to those individuals in their respective departments who made that ultimate change, or who was able to shift the paradigm. Because, paradigm shifters in the mainstream are celebrated as well. Those people actually, tend to become authoritative figures within their field. And then, of course, those authoritative figures essentially begin to act as the police force for whatever particular area of study they rule in. Now, this is where things start to get corrupt. It's important to understand that when you or I nowadays, we start getting into any kind of a historical topic, there's a good chance that this topic has been being worked on for probably a few centuries, if not potentially longer, right? We're not the first people to ask the question, who the hell built the pyramids? We're not the first ones. We're not the first ones to ask a lot of questions. But when we ask these questions, and we decide to look at the evidence that the mainstream uses to support its conclusions, and then we find ourselves in a position looking at the evidence and wondering, how the hell are these people making these conclusions based off of this, shaky at best evidence, or at worst, evidence based on known forgeries, or at the very least, suspected forgeries. It gets horrible. Now, I gotta focus up. I know I'm ranting. But anyway, my main point here is that when we look at the classical Grecian era, we find ourselves in a position that things start to not make sense relative to the mainstream historical chronology when we start to look at the real evidence in a scientific way. Now, this is a problem, because what happens? Once the person starts to look at evidence in a new way, and they start to come to different conclusions. So, for example, the conclusion we're going to make right now in this show is that classical Greece, in the way that the mainstream historians believe it existed, we are going to make the claim that it never existed. And of course, you're going to ask, well, what's that evidence based on? And I've already done one show on this, and we have a lot more to do. But I've already covered one show where we started to talk about the possibility that classical Greece was the exact same time period as the Renaissance. Now, I know that sounds crazy initially, but here's why it sounds crazy. Like I was stating earlier, I know I'm rambling, I'm all over the place. But like I was saying earlier, what happens is that since a lot of these subjects, if not all of the subjects really, have been being studied for the past couple, if not more centuries, what has happened is that we've had several centuries of time for all kinds of people to essentially make their mark on the zeitgeist of history, whether it's correct or not. So what has happened is that, a couple hundred years ago, when people were really starting to look at Greece and really starting to try to figure out, what the hell's going on with the ancient Greeks, there's supposed to be all these crazy cool ruins and there's supposed to be these amazing people, but they don't really find that when they start looking at it. The picture kind of starts to change. And we're not going to cover some of that in this show. I'm going to try to I'm going to focus on Plato. We'll get there. Anyway, so we have a couple of centuries where people have been able to make their mark, and these marks have been essentially etched into the mainstream chronology. And of course, over the centuries, that chronology has essentially been deified. And it's been deified by innocent people. Most of the people who right now, nowadays, regurgitate all of the garbage that you find on Wikipedia or something, all of those people are not evil people. They are legitimate, just, people trying to do their best, and they're not interested in necessarily deceiving anybody, but they're also not interested in losing their job, or their prestige, or their paycheck. So this is where our problem comes into play. So if we have several centuries of potential misinformation becoming the truth, and that's exactly what has happened, and that is exactly what the evidence shows, what happens is that a newer person getting into history now has to not only deal with the basic problem of what the hell was going on in classical Greece and where the hell is Plato, right? Just basic good questions that, don't have good answers, but they also have to then go and fight against the tide of the mainstream historical narrative. And that narrative is not changing. That narrative at this stage in time in historical studies is as solid as a rock. I mean, it's there, it's permanent. You're not allowed to change that paradigm, right? Even though you've been told your whole life that people who make paradigm shifts are the good guys. Those are the guys that get all the fame and the glory and blah, 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 and that's true. But if you're not allowed to change the paradigm with real evidence, what happens to that person? This is where we find newer historians take splitting roads. Like this is the crossroad point in everybody's life as a historian. Because when you start to look at the evidence objectively, in this case, we have real reason to question the existence of Plato. We do. It's a scientific fact. It doesn't matter what anybody says. Remember, science doesn't care about people's feelings, right? It is a scientifically factual problem that we don't have proof that Plato existed in the sense that the mainstream claims that he existed. So anyway, we don't have it. So when you come to this crossroad, I know I can't talk. We come to this crossroad, what happens? Well, there's a few different paths that people take. The first path a lot of people take is they just drop out of history. They're done, right? Because it's just weird. Right. Another good example, I think, that throws people off of the historical trail of stuff would be, for example, the Eastern and Western Rome problem. It doesn't really make sense in the context of mainstream history when you look at it through even just an average person's critical thinking eye, right? You even if you don't care about the stuff, you read what mainstream says about the East and the West, and it's like, what? Like this doesn't really work chronologically. What do these guys, it doesn't make sense. So people move on, right? They just quit because it seems too overwhelming for people, right? They're like, oh, there must be all this crazy stuff going on that I'll never understand. I'm going to drop out of history. And then they drop out. They're done, right? And then they're gone. All right, so fine, we lose a bunch of historians in that direction. Then, of course, if you want to try to be that person who changes the paradigm, then you have to now go up against the people who are already authorities in the mainstream chronology, because these are the people that have been deified by other mainstream people as being, the people who discovered the real truth. And you are not allowed to question that truth, right? And it doesn't even matter if the authority is alive or dead, right? It's irrelevant. If the authority has been established within the mainstream chronology, you are not allowed to question it. Is that a scientifically good thing to do, to not constantly question something? Especially something that we know for a fact that we could not possibly have any real grasp on? I mean, it's crazy. You just want to run into universities and just grab you run up to like a history professor, grab by his hair and just start smashing his head into the board, and then just drag him out of the hallway and just put him, I don't know. Anyway, you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's the kind of enraging problem that we face. But we have to stay calm. We have to breathe. And anyway, so we run into that situation. So the innocent person who wants to try to make a paradigm shift, they immediately find out they cannot. There's no way to make a shift because the authorities have spoken and you will never change that paradigm. So those people drop out as well, right? Or they fall into the alternative history arena where you can also get poisoned and all that stuff. Anyway, so you end up where we are now, basically, right? You become me. Yes, don't kill yourself yet. We have a lot to talk about. All right. So, and then of course the other path that people can take is the path that says, all right, fine, I guess I'm wrong for interpreting the evidence in a different way, even if it's a scientifically based way. I guess the mainstream authority is correct. I will listen to them, and then those people are innocent. They willingly become ignorant, and then they just become part of the machine, right? And now we have to deal with those people as well. Anyway, so that's the problem that we face with respect to trying to understand history. Right? Why did I even talk about all of this? Weren't we going to talk about Plato? Yes, we're going to get to Plato. The only reason why I talk about this kind of stuff is because it's important to understand what's going on psychologically within the historical community and how it is negatively affecting everything. Right? So, just remember, just because you are taking a different path with respect to understanding history, that does not mean you're wrong, and you certainly do not deserve to be treated like garbage like the mainstream treats you. Okay, anyway, you get the point. So, that leaves us in a position to where we can do something like question the existence of Plato. Right? Did Plato actually exist? That's a legitimate scientific question, and there's nothing wrong with it. The interesting thing about this question is that when we start to dive into it from a scientific perspective, but when we start to look at the evidence of Plato's existence, or what the mainstream uses to prop up the idea of Plato, what we immediately find is all kinds of problems. Because if we look at it through like, I'm gonna think about it like a detective, right? You, as a detective trying to solve a crime, we want to ask basic questions to build a picture. All right, so it's not just, did Plato exist? What are other good questions to ask to prove that he existed? I mean, do we know where he lived? Do we know where he ate? Do we know where he traveled? Do we have actual proof of all of these things happening? And I mean scientific proof. And of course the answer is no, we have none of that, right? And how would you even expect to have that kind of proof anyways? And that is one of the things that the mainstream historian will throw at you, is they'll say, well, I mean, we can't know everything, but it's okay to guess at everything. Basically is their mantra, right? But the reality is we have no reason to substantiate Plato as a flesh and blood human that lived during classical Greece. And then, of course, when we start looking at the evidence of Plato, the other problems start to come into focus as well. And one of the main problems that really starts to show up is, of course, did classical Greece exist at all? Or at the very least, did it exist during the time period that mainstream historians claim that it did exist? So this is the kind of problems that we run into when we look at the evidence objectively, when we look at it through a scientific lens. So what are we supposed to do with this? I mean, mainstream ignores it, right? They're not going to change the paradigm. They've got Plato locked in. They're done. They believe he exists exactly as he exists, the way they say it, and you can't say anything against it. So essentially, the mainstream is gone. They're out of their mind. Okay, so we have to discard them scientifically because they are not operating on a scientific level, right? I know I'm like probably repeating myself 8,000 times, but that's the truth. If somebody or some piece of information is not going to be based on science and is not going to allow for any kind of real scrutiny that could lead to potential change, we've just got to move on from that person or that institution if they are not going to deal in science. All right, so let's get into Plato. I know, 20 minutes later. We have our scientific question. Was Plato a real flesh and blood person that lived around 400-ish BC? And did he really write the works that we currently ascribe to him? All right, basic good questions. Anybody who does not think that this is a good question, that's not good. All right, I'll just be nice and say that that person is no longer operating in the realm of science. You know, okay, anyway. Okay, so what I want to do in this show is that I want to lead off with an author named Sylvian Tristan. I finished this book a little bit ago, but he does a really good job of breaking down some of the theories that are out there, and he goes ahead and lays out the evidence in a very easy way to understand. So I'm going to lead off with some of his writings so that, you know, it's not pure schizo me talking and just yelling at the microphone. You can also listen to somebody else who has also done all kinds of research, and of course the research that he ends up citing is also done by some other amazing researchers, all based in science. It's very important to remember this. We're not just pulling stuff out of our butt. You know, we're not just bumping into walls, banging our heads, and being like, "Oh yeah, I don't think Plato existed." That's not what we are doing. We have a legitimate question, you know, and we have a legitimate problem. And there's been a lot of people that have been working on this problem for a while. So let's see what they have to say. So anyway, he breaks it down, and all right, I'm gonna read what he says. Okay, here we go. I don't remember giving you guys the title. The book is also called Redating Ancient Greece, 500 BC equals 1300 AD. Here, really quick, just for those of you who are not familiar with the premise. So what has happened over the past few decades, maybe longer, I don't know if it's, well, yeah, I guess longer. I guess it would have been early 20th century. Anyways, people started asking these questions, like, did ancient Greece really exist? And this was actually, I guess you could argue, if this may have actually been asked in the 1800s. Yeah, you could actually, yeah, anyway, there's that. My main point is that this is not a new phenomenon, I guess is what I'm trying to say after babbling. This problem has been known to historians for quite some time. This is not a new phenomenon. And because it's been known for a little while, there have been a lot of good researchers out there who have actually gone out and tried to figure out what the hell is going on. Like, why are these claims being made, and how are they being substantiated by such little to no evidence, right? It's a problem. So other people have noticed this. Anyway, so what was eventually discovered, or I should say the conclusion that was eventually come to after a lot of research within the subject of, you know, did ancient Greece exist at all? What happened is that people started looking at chronology, and chronologists started finding that there was all kinds of like phantom time essentially added to the ancient Grecian chronology. We find ourselves in a situation to where, in fact, 1800 years were added to Greek chronology. Right? This is where we find like the Greek Dark Ages, and there's all these weird gray areas that mainstream kind of just hand waves away. It gets really weird. Like, mainstream chronology is an absolute joke, and I've covered this on all kinds of other shows, and we'll keep talking about it. But the main point here is, with respect to ancient Greece, is that what researchers eventually discovered was that, yes indeed, 1800 years of non-existent time appear to have been added to Greek chronology. Of course, the next question is either how or why. Like, what do you mean, 1800 years? Like, maybe you could see like maybe 100 or something, or, you know, something like that. Something small, something simple, because we all know we don't have all the answers. But 1800 years? Yeah, 1800 years. Right? And it gets, you know, the evidence is all based on science. This is not based on schizo stuff either. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that part. Just know that we are now looking at ancient Greece from a position to where it doesn't look like it ever existed in the sense of what mainstream says. Instead, what it looks like is that what we consider the classical age of Greece, the time when, you know, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all of those philosophers existed, was not during the 400 BC era, but it was instead during the Renaissance era, you know, between 1300 and 1500 AD. That is basically what the researchers have discovered. Now, this conclusion came from the evidence. Nobody jumped into that particular subject saying, oh yeah, my hypothesis is randomly, I think 1800 years was added to Greece history. And then people just started trying to prove that. No, it's the exact opposite. Science and research was done, and what happened is that this 1800 years popped out as the conclusion from looking at the evidence scientifically. Now, mainstream historians aren't doing this. They don't have any interest in any of that. They don't want to look at the history through a realistic point of view. But when you do that, you end up finding out that, yeah, hey, guess what? We actually don't have any real evidence that classical Greece existed. If we don't have any real evidence that classical Greece existed, why would we think that Plato existed during a period that never existed? You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's just crazy. Like, the stuff mainstream people believe is just absolutely bonkers. It's insane. Okay, we've already covered the insanity. All right, let's get down to, let's read the book now. All right, I've talked long enough. Let's get to what Sylvia and Tristan writes. And remember, it's not just him. He's brought all this information together, and he's made his own conclusions as well. But there's a lot of good sources in here as well that we can explore, and we will, depending on the time. Okay. So this section in the book is called Plato and Plato. To this day, Plato remains one of the most celebrated philosophers in history, and one of the most influent thinkers of all time. Plato's student, Aristotle, whose ideas were at odds with those of his teacher, is no less illustrious, just like Plato's own teacher, Socrates, who remains a major figure of Western philosophy. Plato and Aristotle are supposed to have lived in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. According to controversial history, Plato was born around 425 BC and died in between 348 and 347 BC. Aristotle is said to have lived between 384 BC and 322 BC. The last date being exactly the year when Athens fell to the Macedonians, marking the end of Athenian democracy. Now, these dates are going to be important, so keep them in mind, right? So 384, 322, 425, basically 300 and 400. We can stick to the hundreds, and you'll see why in just a bit. All right. The question is Plato the phantom duplicate of Plato? Few people are aware of this, but a man named Gregorius Gemistus Plato is remembered in Byzantine history as one of the most influential and original thinkers of his time, and one of the greatest philosophers of the 15th century. He lived nearly a century. Plato was Greek and is said to have been a, quote, Neoplatonic, unquote, philosopher, as he was a great admirer of Plato and had developed very similar philosophical ideas. He is also credited as being one of the chief pioneers of the revival of Greek learning in Rome and other Western capitals during the Renaissance, supposedly lost for centuries. And of course, this is one of the problems that we immediately run into when we start to look at ancient Greece, and we start to kind of follow how Plato's works existed throughout history. You know, the reality is Plato essentially goes, he exists, then he's forgotten, then he's brought back, then he's forgotten, and then he's brought back. And in between the times that he's forgotten, I mean, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of years in between these times. In fact, in one case, there's essentially an entire millennium between the time when Platonism is revived and then disappears again. Right? Historians have no problem saying that this is exactly what happened. Right, so for some weird reason, Plato is awesome, all this philosophy is everywhere, and then suddenly everything in Greece dies and stops. It's done. And then magically, a few hundred years later, he's revived again, and then for whatever reason, it stops and dies again. And then again, it is after about 1,000 years from, I think it's the 300-ish, 200-ish AD time period. And then once again in the Renaissance, Plato magically shows up again. Now, for those of you who are aware of how the phantom duplicate situation happens, you kind of already know what's going on there, right? I get that. But for those of you who are not quite following what's going on here, one of the things that has been discovered while studying Renaissance works and general history is that we have found that during the Renaissance period of time, there were all kinds of forgeries being created. And there's a whole thing on that. And I've covered this several times, and we have tons more to cover. But just know that during the Renaissance, there was literally an industry that was pumping out false and forged works that people used as real history. And this is a fact. No, mainstream doesn't even argue this. They just ignore it. Because if they were to pay attention to this situation, right, if they were to admit that the vast majority, if not all of the works from the Renaissance are all, forged copies or altered copies or outright lies or creations or whatever, suddenly the entire chronology falls apart. And that's what they don't want to deal with. Even if one document is wrong, actually, even if one of their documents that they cite is wrong, the entire chronology has to shift. So the fact that these guys won't even acknowledge like one of the forged books that they use to base their chronology on, I mean, it's absolute insanity. The mainstream's crazy. Anyways, what happened during the Renaissance, really quick, and he probably talks about it, but what happened is that when Renaissance writers were forging all these documents, they would use events that happened during their time, and then they would duplicate them, change them just a little bit, and then send them way back in history. And there was all kinds of reasons to do this, whether somebody was trying to be a land grabber or prove their bloodline or whatever. There's tons of reasons why this was done. But anyways, the Renaissance people, they did all of this, and then mainstream modern historians, instead of looking at it the way it should have been looked at, as all of this stuff is lies and forgeries and half-truths, instead they took all of these old books from the Renaissance and they took them as chronologically true. And that is one of the reasons why we run into the problem that we run into. And it's also one of the reasons why we can make the claim that 1800 years has been added to Greek history. Okay, we'll keep reading. The similarities between Plato and Plato are numerous. Let us list them down here in general terms before studying the details. So here he gives a list of similarities between these two guys. 1. Similar names, Plato and Plato. 2. Same language, Greek. 3. Same field of activity, philosophy. 4. Similar notoriety. Plato was the greatest philosopher of his time in the 14th and 15th century, and of course Plato was the greatest ancient philosopher of his time. 5. Comparable life length. Let's see what we got. Plato lived for between 92 and 100 years. Plato supposedly lived between 75 and 80 years. And both dates are uncertain. I don't know if mainstream acknowledges that, but those are extrapolated dates, I guess you could say. 6. Both had similar influential teachers. 7. Both had similar ideas. 1 created Platonism, i.e. the notion of the material world is just an imperfect copy of the ideal world of, quote, forms, unquote. And Plato defended Platonism and was considered a Neoplatonist. And I know that doesn't maybe necessarily seem like evidence, but at the end of the day, there's an association between the two, and it gets crazier. 8. They had similar writings. Plato wrote The Republic and the Laws. Plato wrote a book called The Treaty of Laws, based on Plato's The Laws and the Republic. 9. They had the same religious beliefs. They were both polytheistic. 10. They were both similar in making the guy named Plato, whoever that really was, famous. 11. They both found Platonic academies. And 12. They both have a similar student. Aristotle, who opposed Plato and invented Aristotelianism, and Scholaris, who opposed Plato and was a defender of Aristotelianism. Aristotelianism. Yeah, I know, I can't read for crap. But anyway, there's 12 points of extreme similarities between two historical philosophers. Now, you can challenge all of those points, and you should, but let's keep going and see if we can't continue to build a case that essentially Plato is the creator of Plato. In spite of many differences in the details, the parallelism is striking. Each philosopher's life basically following the same general blueprint. And this is what we find with Phantom Time. This is what we find with duplicated and triplicated events all throughout history. In addition to that, Plato is supposed to have lived almost exactly 1800 years before Pletho. According to Scaligerrian chronology, and depending on the dates retained, Plato and Pletho died either 1,798 years or 1,802 years apart. Here comes the 1,800 year gap again. Remember, that date is important to proving that ancient Greece never existed, at least not in the sense that mainstream historians believe it existed. What the list above and this time gap strongly suggest, once again, is that either Plato is the phantom duplicate of Pletho, or Plato is a fictitious character created by Pletho. Now, there's nothing weird about any of those claims, right? It's entirely possible that Plato is a fictitious character. Once again, we don't have any solid evidence of Plato's real existence. I don't think people understand that. We don't have his grave, we don't have his house, we don't know where he hung out. We just don't know anything about him at that level, so we're not able to track anything back to him that proves that he was a physical person. We have to remember that. That's just the reality, and that's a reality that plagues all of history. I mean, it's not just Plato, it's not just Aristotle or whatever. I mean, it's even things like Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great may not be a real person. He may also be a phantom duplicate. Yeah, I know it gets crazy. I know that sounds insane, but this is where the evidence takes us. All right, let's keep going with the book. All right. Is Socrates the phantom duplicate of Eleusis? So what we're going to do now is we're also going to look at Plato's students, or the philosophers around Plato, to see if they also suffer the same kind of duplication situation that Pletho and Plato suffer from. Because the reality is, if Plato is not a real person, then that throws characters like Socrates and Aristotle into question as well, because they're connected to Plato. So we are going to need to analyze those two characters as well to see if they suffer from the same problem. Because in theory, if our 1800-year proposition is real, yeah, they should be suffering kind of the same situation. So let's see if they do. Is Socrates the phantom duplicate of Eleusis? Socrates is supposed to have been Plato's teacher, greatly influencing him and his philosophical ideas. Socrates is quite an enigmatic figure who left no writing. He is known only through the accounts of Plato, students, and classical writers. Socrates had to face trial for several reasons, among which impiety and atheism, and also for creating new divinities. The traditional verdict of the trial is well known. He was sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. Let us jump 1800 years forward. Eleusis was Pletho's teacher, greatly influencing his life and philosophical ideas. He was a Jewish professor in Adrianopolis, today part of the European portion of Turkey. At the time, though, Adrianopolis was the capital city of the Ottoman Sultanate. Eleusis was an expert on Kabbalah and Zoroastrianism, a Persian monotheistic religion. In 1390, Eleusis was executed by the Turks, who burned him on the stake, perhaps accidentally, but this seems doubtful, because his religious ideas went against those promoted by the Turks. Although different in the details, Socrates and Eleusis' lives have two very similar blueprints, as one can plainly see. According to conventional history, the two men died 1,789 years apart from one another. Now, it's really important to understand something when we look at the situation of phantom duplicates. We are not going to find every single detail lining up. The Renaissance forgers who created all this garbage, they did not sit there and copy paste and essentially just change the names. In some cases, they don't actually even change the names. That's how crazy it gets. But what they do is they basically use the lives of people that currently exist. So in this case, Plato or Lysias in this case. They use them as the basis for the lies that they are going to create and then throw back 1800 years. So if you're looking for, or I should say, don't look for exact duplicate details. You actually do find them, which is hilarious, but you're not always going to find them. So that's one of the things that can throw people off. So just be aware of that. Okay, let's go on to Aristotle. Is Aristotle the phantom duplicate of Scholaris? Just like Plato had a student, Aristotle, who opposed his master's ideas and became a celebrated philosopher too, Plato had a student, Gennadius Scholaris, or Scholarios in Greek, who also had an antagonistic ideas and became a respected philosopher in his time. Scholaris was also a theologian and the economical patriarch of Constantinople right after the fall of the city in 1453. Scholaris was a staunch defender of Aristotle's ideas. He wrote a book emphasizing the importance of empiricism, which later gave birth to the scientific method, opposing Platonic ideas. Unfortunately, the book is now lost. And that's like with every book. Any book that may have had any kind of real evidence in it is just gone. It's hilarious. It's just, ugh. Anyway, a critic might immediately observe that the two names, Aristotle and Gennadius Scholaris, are different. But is that really so? The name Gennadius comes from the Greek Gennadus, which means noble, generous, while the name Scholaris comes either from the Latin schola or the Greek scholio, which relates to the English, quote, school, unquote, and, quote, student, unquote, and means, quote, scholar, unquote. The name taken as a whole can be translated as the noble student, probably Plato's noble student. The name Aristotle comes from the Greek aristos, meaning the noblest, the best, excellent, to which is added the suffix telos, which means aim or purpose. So the whole name means something like the noblest purpose. We see that the names are actually close to each other and look like nicknames, both probably paying tribute to the exceptional intellectual qualities of the two students, who are supposed to have lived in two very different times, and who are said to have been taught by two distinct teachers. But is that really so? Let's sum up the common points between Aristotle and Scholaris in this list. And he's going to give a quick list, and I'll just briefly go through it. All right, so Aristotle and Scholaris are identical in these ways. They both have comparable names. They both have a very similar early life. They both have the same field of activity. They both have similar attitudes towards their masters. They both have similar philosophical ideas, similar political contexts, and comparable functions in their day-to-day lives. Again, the parallelism between Aristotle and Scholaris is quite obvious. And it really begs the question, why are we finding, these three philosophers doing the exact same things that three other philosophers were essentially doing 1800 years earlier? I mean, why would that even exist? There's no reason to find that in history. It's just weird that it exists at all. So to not pay attention to this, you can't you got to pay attention. It's important. I mean, this is a real problem. If we are finding similarities and we are finding problems with the works of supposed philosophers, like this evidence really does point in a direction that proves that at the very least something is going on. Right? So here, let's keep going. The time interval between Aristotle's death and Scholaris' death is 1,794 years. A gap which is once more very close to our 1800-year time gap. We are left with the impression that Aristotle is the phantom duplicate of Scholaris. Alright, so that sets the stage for us now having even more foundational evidence to possibly make the claim that Plato is not a real person. Let's see what other evidence that we have, right? Let's keep going. Screw it. Alright, focus on the Republic, further clues connecting Plato and Pletho. Plato's Socratic dialogue, The Republic, is the philosopher's most famous and influential work. It is generally considered as Plato's masterpiece and is supposed to have been written in 380 BC. The book deals with the notions of justice in the city-state. Pletho, approximately 1,794 years later, according to the currently accepted chronology, wrote a series of books about political, legal, economic, religious, social, and moral reforms, usually referred to as the Treaty of Laws. That's almost exactly 1,800 years later. According to textbook history, of course, the books are based on Plato's works. At the time, Pletho was in exile in Mystris in the Peloponnese, because his support for Plato was considered as, quote, heretic, unquote, for the Turks of Adrianople, where he had been living since he was a student. Unfortunately, nearly all the pages of Pletho's books were deliberately burnt by Scholaris because of their anti-Christian contents. So almost nothing of Plato's works, Pletho's works, survives today. One cannot help thinking how ironical it is that Pletho's books, which were written only 6 centuries ago, did not survive, while Plato's Republic, thought to have been written 24 centuries ago, made it until today. And that's a real problem. Like, how the hell are all of these supposed ancient philosophers' works surviving the second law of thermodynamics, and according to mainstream people, somehow they're all being perfectly translated down to us throughout the literal millenniums? It's just ridiculous to think about it like that. But mainstream historians, they don't think about it like that. They don't think about it at all. They don't care, right? They believe that all of this was transmitted down the centuries without any issue. No copying problems, no language issues, just nothing. Everything is fine. Shut up and read it and just, obey. Like that is literally the position that mainstream historians take when it comes to this stuff. Okay. Where was I? Incidentally, it is actually quite astonishing for ancient manuscripts in general to have survived, agreed, by being copied down through the centuries, until the invention of the printing press, or at least until paper reached Europe. Paper arrived in Europe only in the late 12th or 13th century with the Mongols. When paper was still unavailable in Europe, people had to rely on parchment, either made of calfskin, sheepskin, or goat skin. And by the way, parchment is one hell of a thing to make. Like, if you go and look up the process for creating parchment out of, animal skins, holy crap, it's insane. I think people think parchment is like easy to make and stuff. Nah, dude, it's an insane process. So parchment was, that's why it was expensive, and that's why it was rare. Okay. Anyway, where the hell was I? People, goatskin. Considering that the production of just one parchment was an extremely long and hard process, it defies common sense to comprehend how ancient manuscripts, hundreds of pages long, managed to reach the time when paper finally became available. And yet, we are told that Plato's books all managed to survive until the arrival of paper in the 13th century, at a time when only papyri in the Middle East and parchment in Europe were available, i.e., for a staggering millennium and a half. In addition, why would Christian monks keep copying down non-Christian writings for so many centuries? And that's another thing to remember. For whatever reason, we find ourselves in a position to where historians have no problem saying that Christian monks, who are supposed to literally be obligated into destroying everything that is non-Christian, for some weird reason keep all of these works perpetuated throughout the centuries. That doesn't even make sense. There's no reason to even believe that. But that's what mainstream historians have to say to continue to make sure that their chronology stays accurate. All things considered, isn't it more logical to assume that Plato and Pletho were one and the same person? That the 1800-year time gap between them is non-existent, and that parts of the philosopher's life ended up in two different biographies, which were written by different people. The Rashomon effect and other similar event distorting factors blurring the picture. A second tantalizing possibility is that Plato is a fictional character created by Pletho. But in that case, why would he have done that? Alright, so there's basically two theories when it comes to Plato. So the first theory is that Plato is just a fictitious phantom duplicate created by the Renaissance forgers so that they could actually pad out all of the new centuries and millennium that they were creating. So this is a standard tactic that they used over and over again, and Plato may have been one of these creations. But there's another possibility as well, and he gets into it in the next section. Alright, so are Plato's works forgeries created by Pletho? Let us reiterate our two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1. Pletho was Plato. And later generations, especially after Scaliger and Ptah's time, came to believe Pletho and Plato were two different philosophers. It then became necessary to assume that the similarities between the two could only be accounted for if Pletho was a great admirer of Plato, a fact which posthumously awarded Pletho the title of Neoplatonist. Remember, Pletho never calls himself a Neoplatonist, by the way. That does not exist in history. Hypothesis 2. Plato was Pletho's pseudo. First, writing under a pseudo is a common practice for writers in general, and it may have been a way for Pletho to put forward his philosophical ideas. But do we know of any convincing reason why he would have played such a trick? Interestingly, Pletho had excellent reasons for creating a fictitious philosopher for his own ends. His former teacher, Eliseus, whom he had admired so much and who set him on a philosophical track he was to pursue until the end of his very life, was executed by the Turks in 1390, 25 years before Pletho published his pamphlets greatly resembling Plato's Republic. As said above, Pletho used to live in Adrianople, where he had been a student of Eliseus. But because of his religious and philosophical views, he was an anti-Christian, which were quite similar to those of his mentor. Plato was exiled to Mistras in Greece, where he spent the most important years of his life and where he eventually died about 45 years later. One can easily guess that he certainly didn't want to end up burnt at the stake like Eliseus. This might have prompted him to write under the pseudo of Plato, an imaginary illustrious philosopher of yore, while claiming he was only one of his humble later disciples, in order to remain safe. That would have been the only way for him to keep spreading his pagan ideas without jeopardizing his own life. In that case, Socrates, who was only known through Plato and a few other, quote, classical, unquote, authors, was probably another fictional persona created by Pletho, a persona meant to pay tribute to his late teacher Eliseus. Now, Pletho may have been helped in his forgery by fellow writers at the time, people who are now wrongly considered ancient. So who was Aristotle? Using the same reasoning as in Hypothesis 1, it might be that some of Scholaris's writings were later attributed to Aristotle. Using a similar reasoning as in Hypothesis 2, it might be that Pletho, or a fellow writer, allegorically decided to refer to Scholaris's ideas by using the fictional name Aristotle, a supposedly ancient writer living at the same time as Plato in order to stay out of trouble. Although this hypothesis might sound incredible, it becomes quite logical once the 1800-year time gap is suppressed. Once we get rid of those 1800 years and we start looking at all the evidence that we have, suddenly a lot of this stuff starts to come together. Now, this book keeps on going and going on all kinds of evidence to support the possibility that Plato is nothing more than either a fictitious pseudo of the philosopher Plato, or he's a phantom duplicate created by later Scaligerrian historians when they were trying to put together, their chronology. All right, so we're coming up on an hour, and that's enough reading for me. I know, I suck at reading, but the information is there. I highly recommend picking up this book. Now, if this is true, if one of these two claims are possible, either the pseudonym or the phantom duplicate, that means Plato is a fictitious character. If Plato is a fictitious character, what are the implications for something like Atlantis now? This book doesn't cover anything like that, but one of the main pieces or sources of information that we have about Atlantis comes from Plato. If Plato's fictitious, that means Plato was writing instead of Plato. So what did Plato know? Right? What acts was Plato just pulling this out of his butt? Or did Plato have access to other writings that we no longer have access to? Or how would he know this story, right? It's a good question, and not one I have an answer for or anything. But we also have to remember that these guys writing back then, they did indeed have access to works which are just not existent anymore, right? They're either locked up in the Vatican, or some private person has them, or they've been outright destroyed. Like, this is the reality that we face. But Plato, he probably had access to other ancient works, so it begs the question, when Atlantis is being talked about, and we assume Plato is the author, what is he basing those claims off of? What is he basing all of those descriptions off of? Yeah, it makes you wonder what he had access to. I'm just throwing it out there. We'll explore that in a completely different show. But it does change the perspective. Now, for the Atlantis side of things, Plato is not the only source of evidence for Atlantis, by the way. I don't know why people say that. Literally, cultures all around the Atlantic have some sort of story about a sinking continent with the prefix of ATL, right? And that's all over the place. So it would actually make sense that Plato has access to some sort of manuscript that maybe discusses something that had happened in the past, and that he was just recounting it, just like Plato was recounting it. I don't know. Anyway, just something to think about. All right, so at this point in time, we can make the scientific claim that Plato may have never existed. And then, of course, by extension, we can also make the claim that ancient Greece, in the classical period as we know it now in mainstream chronology, that also probably never existed either. Now, the good news is that all of the evidence actually does come together, and it points to a real conclusion. And the real conclusion is that classical Greece was indeed the Renaissance. The only reason why we put 1800 years between the two periods is because of corrupt historians trying to put stuff together back in the day. And that's just a fact, right? We can't ignore this. So when we start to look at ancient Greece, and if we have to shift all that ancient Grecian stuff into the 14 and 1500s, that changes everything, right? But it also starts to make things that we find in history make a lot more sense. When we start to look at the history of the area, right, the Roman and the Grecian area, the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean, once we start to get rid of a lot of these phantom time periods, a lot of the evidence that we have out there for things that are completely misinterpreted by the mainstream, they start to fit together in a realistic way that actually makes sense historically. So that's where we find ourselves. All right, that's enough of this garbage. We'll keep talking about this stuff later, but I highly recommend grabbing this book. Once again, it's Redating Ancient Greece by Sylvie and Tristan. Like, I'm not laying claims to any of this information, by the way. This is all from him and all the other great researchers out there who have done this. I just wanted to share this with you guys because we have to build a foundation. That's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to build a real foundation based on facts, real history, and science so that we can try and understand what the hell happened in the past. Another reason why evidence like this is actually really important is because it helps to shed light on the catastrophe side of history. Because now we can look at ancient Greece and realize, oh hey, there was no such thing as ancient Greece in the way that we think about it today. Once we can get rid of that period, that means all of the destruction that has been talked about and recorded throughout history, that also starts to make a lot more sense. I'm not going to get into it right now because that's a whole 10 million other shows, but that's what we're building towards. Like, the evidence all points in that direction. All right, so that's it. So Plato never existed as a historical figure. He's fake. And of course, classical Greece is also complete garbage. It never existed. Something to think about. Take it seriously. This evidence cannot be discarded. It just can't be. Everything we just talked about is a legitimate problem for the mainstream. And of course, the mainstream is not going to address it. So it's on us to do it. All right? And we're just going to keep on going.